For more on efforts throughout the region to ensure housing accessibility and access for tenants and homeowners, we turn to our panel of experts. First up, Sahli, President of Family Housing Fund, an organization working to build a strong housing system that allows people, communities, and regions to prosper. Ms. Sahli joined the Family Housing Fund as president in 2015. Welcome. Lisa McDonald, founding member and organizer of the MinneapolisForEveryone.org, a group funded in 2017 to disseminate information and lobby on the Minneapolis 2040 Comprehensive Plan. McDonald served as 10th Ward Minneapolis City Council member from 1993 to 2001. Cathy Bennett, Director of Advisory Service and Product Councils with the Urban Land Institute of Minnesota. Ms. Bennett has over 30 years of experience in the community, and her work focuses on tools and strategies in cities to provide a full range of housing choices. And Margaret Kaplan, President of the Housing Justice Center, which works to encourage the production of affordable housing, the preservation of affordable housing, and the protection of the rights of people who need affordable places to call home. Joining these great ladies on stage is Jessica Lee, a local government reporter with MinnPost, who will moderate this conversation. Thank you all and welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having us. So yes, I work for what's called MinnPost, a nonprofit newsroom based here in Minneapolis, and I focus on housing and transit with my reporting. And I'm eager to hear what our panelists have to say about some of the issues that came up with the speakers earlier this morning. So first, before we get going, I would like to learn a little bit more about the perspective that you're coming from, the expertise that you're sharing that maybe wasn't a part of the conversation earlier today. Would you like to start? Okay.
Sure, why not? Hi, and first of all, thank you so much for allowing me to be here. Housing Justice Center, as I mentioned, is focused on the production, preservation, and protection of folks in affordable housing. Our perspective is really coming from both a fair housing standpoint, so we do legal and policy advocacy, and we also have a pretty deep focus on affordability. So really focusing primarily our efforts on households who are making less than about $30,000 a year, because that's the area where we're seeing the deepest need. So in terms of the way that we interact with this conversation, we really want to think about it as, how can we be doing more, and how can we have a more transformative approach to thinking about the history of land ownership and who benefits and who's burdened by the decisions that are being made.
Great, Cathy?
Yeah, Urban Land Institute, Minnesota, we're really a trusted convener, and our sweet spot is between conversations and coming to solutions between the public and private sectors. And we do this through the support that we provide through the Regional Council of Mayors, which has grown from 8 mayors in 2004 to over 60 mayors currently. And they come together on a monthly basis really to try to develop solutions together. And that's really the area that we support in this full range of housing choices, but also the really important connection between jobs, housing, and transportation. That's kind of the 3 pillars that we focus on to build sustainable communities.
Great. Lisa?
Minneapolis for Everyone started when the 2040 plan first started to progress. We felt it was a massive experiment without really any statistical evidence it was going to work. But now that we have it, one of the things that we're focused on is how do we make sure that the racial equity things get implemented, that what we're seeing right now is that developers have been given carte blanche in the city of Minneapolis, and so we're not getting a lot of affordable, which was what we were told we would get, but we will get a lot of density, but it will be mostly market rate, and they are developing in areas of the city that already would have had development. But the north side of town, which is where more of our African American and immigrant community is not, they're not going there. So that's one issue. Secondly is that we think we need more deeply affordable, 30 to 50%, and that's our focus. But I think the biggest issue is the issue of home ownership. Home ownership is a way that people, particularly people of color, low income immigrants, really create real generational wealth. And both Councilmember Bender and our planning director, Heather Worthington, have said that we're not addressing home ownership in this plan because we don't believe that it actually does create generational wealth. But when you have 76% of the white community in 2015 owning homes and only, I think it's 34% of the people of color owning homes, clearly it's an issue. And it is how you build stability in your neighborhoods, and it's also how I think you let families create generational wealth and send their kids to college, etc. So this is a racial equity plan. It's really falling down on a very pivotal portion, which is home ownership.
Thank you. Ellen?
Hi, thank you. I'm Ellen Sahli with the Family Housing Fund. And the Family Housing Fund works in the 7-county metro area to help communities address their housing challenge. So we work to increase housing supply by new development as well as preservation of existing housing. But second, we also work very hard to increase access and opportunity to make sure that low-income families and people who need access to the units has a uniform and fair way to access those units.
Great. All right, so I know it's been mentioned a few times, both in this conversation and also earlier today, Minneapolis 2040. Minneapolis made national headlines, as I'm sure most of us know, about eliminating single-family zoning, the first major city to do so. What does that really mean within this broader picture of a shortage of affordable housing? That's question number one. Question number two, what are some of the suburban areas doing in terms of increasing density or not even really considering more density to fill this gap?
Well, you know, I think it's interesting. When I think about this issue of density and affordability in the context of the 2040 plan, I think about density as being necessary but insufficient to create affordability. And I will say, you know, there is a tendency, and I think specifically in the national media, to really kind of blow up what Minneapolis is saying they're trying to do with 2040. I don't think anybody in the city of Minneapolis is saying, well, gosh darn it, we've solved affordability through triplexes. However, we have done some research that shows that, you know, one of the cost drivers for building affordable housing is time and density. So these are really important. However, there are challenges with that. If you do the density without regulation that's going to drive affordability, you're not likely to get as much as you can if you're really putting in some systems and controls. The other thing is, you know, land ownership is what it is, and changing the zoning doesn't change that there are decades and centuries of people benefiting from the way land ownership is operated in this country. So we have to be ready to have some pretty transformative discussions about who owns land and who's benefited from this historically, and what do we do in order to change this. The suburbs are doing some pretty innovative things, I would say, just in terms of trying to encourage more affordability and more density, particularly some of their approaches to inclusionary zoning policies. That's also a conversation that's been happening pretty actively in Minneapolis as well, too. So it's good to see these things sort of growing and changing and communities learning from each other, but we're not going nearly far enough.
Sure. So inclusionary zoning is a rule that would mandate developers to include a portion of their developments to units that are below market rate rent levels. And Minneapolis is in the process of finalizing what that zoning code would look like. Developers have a pretty organized effort against the change, saying that it would really hurt their bottom line. Do we have anything else to add on this density question in the suburbs and Minneapolis 2040 in a broader context?
Yeah, I can speak about the suburbs. That's mostly the work that we do with our Regional Council of Mayors is in the suburbs. And we've seen a significant shift from the work that we started 10, 12 years ago, where you could not even really talk about affordable housing, to now the majority of the communities where we've done work in, 80 plus conversations around the metro area, has been how do we get affordability, and the understanding that for them to be economically competitive that they need to support affordable housing. And so we've seen a lot of different cities really taking a leadership role in upping their game with regards to adding more tools to their toolbox, as well as incorporating the support of affordability in new development, and modifying their codes around tenant protections for preservation. So there's just been a lot of work done in the suburbs. And the one thing I want to mention, there's this new term that was coined out of the ULI National Urban Trends Report in 2020, is hipstervia. And that really is the migration now of the millennials moving from the great things that they loved about Minneapolis and the density in Minneapolis to suburban locations where now cities are creating these live, work, and play locations. And they're really supporting added density with new housing in shopping centers such as Ridgedale, reinventing the downtown neighborhoods in Hopkins and Robbinsdale, and then creating these new live-work places like West End. So there's a lot going on in the suburbs around housing affordability, and density.
Just two things I want to touch on that. One is in the suburbs, we've noticed that in their inclusionary housing plans, a lot of folks have chosen to buy in. They pay a fee as opposed to doing the building, particularly in Edina. But I think just the interim inclusionary housing policy the city had, which this new policy will replace, basically it didn't really generate, I think it generated 7 units. And there's a lot of hoops, et cetera, to jump through. And it'll be very interesting to see if the second inclusionary housing policy actually produces the types of things. And of course, it's closer to market rate. It's 60 to 80. It's not the deeply affordable. The other thing I want to point out is that the whole triplex issue, which everyone has talked about. Oh, everyone can go build a triplex and they can own it and they can make money and then they'll build some wealth. The problem with that is that the entrance to the market in terms of house price is the same price that triplex developers are in. And so if you want to buy that house, but someone wants to build a triplex there, they're going to beat you to it as a homeowner. And so, and then they're going to demo it, and they're going to build a market rate triplex. So once again, we're not really creating the real types of housing that we want to have in the city.
I think it's really important to remember how much of a housing shortage we have. So anything that increases supply is an important first step. It's not the only one, but we do need to ensure we are building enough housing to meet the demand. Earlier panelists talked about the housing shortage. We know that we have underbuilt in our region, and every year that we are underbuilding, while simultaneously having an increase in population, exacerbates our housing challenge. We have underbuilt and we are growing. That is a recipe for a region that quickly could become not competitive if we don't respond. And we've done some research that talked about the importance of being able to respond in order to continue to support that growth in the region, that fuels the state, and makes our economy strong.
Sure, very great points. Something that was mentioned was this push towards strengthening protections for tenants. It's been said that both Minneapolis and St. Paul have a renter majority now, and we've seen a wave of policies, specifically in Minneapolis, to number one, change the screening application process for renters and also cap security deposits. We've also heard talk of rent control or rent stabilization. Let's unpack what this moment means in terms of policymaking here in the Twin Cities.
I think that we need to be thinking about this tenant protection, these policies. We need to be thinking about them not just in Minneapolis and St. Paul. We need to be thinking about them on a state level. We need to be thinking about them in suburban communities as well. And there are some real opportunities right now to be thinking about issues like rent stabilization, tenant opportunity to purchase. So this opportunity for folks who are paying the bills in rental housing to have decision-making powers when things are going to be changing with their housing. This is absolutely critical as well, too. Issues related to zoning reform and ownership reform, just cause, making sure that people can't be non-renewed from their rental housing because a landlord has decided that they just want somebody else there, or they want to do something different with that property with no recourse for the people who are living there. So I think these are really important discussions to have, especially as we're experiencing mass displacement all over the metro area.
Adding on to that, housing stability is an important feature. We need to support families to maintain this housing that they have. We are doing a lot of work in eviction prevention because we know that we can do more to support families that are in crisis to maintain that housing. So while that might not be called tenant protection, it's an important element of ensuring an overall stable housing market for those that are relying on rental housing as their housing choice.
Sure.
And I would say added to that, certainly the tenant protections and all of those efforts are really important. And also what we hear from our mayors is the preservation of their natural occurring affordable housing and what tools can they access to help facilitate that. They want to see the older housing in their community as quality as possible. Also, they don't want to see their residents displaced, but in many suburban communities, they feel like they have limited resource to do that. So all of these conversations help them to become smarter, help them to kind of learn about the different tools and strategies that are working in other locations, and that is going to help the region overall in the long run.
Great points. Thank you. Thank you all. So now we have some time for some audience questions. Yes, right here. I think we have someone with the mic.
Yes, thank you for being here. Thanks for taking my question. I work with an organization called Mobile Homes and Fishes, and we make sandwiches and different hot meals for the homeless. And we put them on a truck and we bring them around to the homeless people. And the gentleman before said, who's benefiting the most from the recent housing problem? And that couldn't be answered. But I will tell you, from my experience, who's benefiting the least are the homeless. And as we go around, we see now, because we also work with helping people get into homes. Many have gotten into homes and becoming into rental homes and are becoming stable with resources. But now, in the areas particularly where the multiplex units are going up, the rents are also going to be going up.
Well, should we ask this panel what they think in terms of who's benefiting?
Well, I just want to say that this is not going to happen until March. And I will back that up by saying, if you look at a national survey where the rental units prices, the fair market rental price in Minnesota and Minneapolis particularly, is going up faster than anywhere else in the nation. So we want to know what, I know you said you're going to try to stabilize the rent control people, but it's really not happening, and a lot of places are just raising the rent. So let's remember the homeless and maybe build some housing, because they're going to double in size in March if all these people are put out of their homes. Thank you.
Sure. So finding a question within that, let's have this panel answer who they think is profiting off of this shortage that we have. I know the mayor and Lisa Bender was asked that question.
I don't think anybody is profiting. I mean, I think it's a crisis around the whole entire spectrum. I mean, you may think that developers are profiting, corporations are profiting, but they have to make money to stay in business. And it's the responsibility of all to really come together as a partnership to try to help develop solutions. And that does mean, yes, that developers need to be at the table and take responsibility. The state needs to be there, the federal government, the local community, residents and individuals, as well as corporation. I think it takes everyone to help solve this problem.
I disagree. I think that there are people who are profiting off of the current situation. You know, the history of land ownership, once again, people who've had the opportunity to own land and control what is happening with land are profiting. Developers, for-profit developers, are profiting. And we see every day, as we're working with people who are experiencing unjustifiably high rents and fees that, quite frankly, are illegal, that there are people who are getting absolutely milked for every dime from their current landlords. So somebody is profiting off of this. I do agree, though, that there are ways that we can work together across sectors, and I also think we can have that conversation in a really powerful and effective way, including a broad trajectory, a broad range of people with a bunch of different perspectives as well, too, from people who have the most transformative ideas about what the future of home and land ownership is going to be, to folks who are really central to our current conversations about housing.
And to clarify, Margaret, I'm not saying that developers are not profiting and landlords are not profiting, but if we don't solve this solution together, nobody's going to be profiting. That's the point that I was trying to make.
I would agree that in Minneapolis, I think because of the way 2040 has been structured in terms of taking off all the rules, any kind of zoning, gives developers carte blanche. Well, the problem is what's happened here is that we've had many developers come nationally into Minneapolis because they're like, boy howdy, this is going to be great. You know, we're going to make some money. And clearly most of them are building market rate and above. So we know that that's what they were thinking. Well, the problem with that is that you give them the power to eventually build what they want. It doesn't necessarily increase the amount of housing stock we have. And when the economy changes, they leave. Whereas if the city had put a little bit more structure to this in terms of what they could build and what they can't build and where we want it, instead of just saying whatever, we would have been able to say, yes, we're seeing some increases, or we're getting the kind of housing we want here. We're going to get some actual more housing units. I don't think the inclusionary housing policy will provide very many units over the course of its life.
I would say, I would say, though, that I don't think what we're experiencing today is a consequence of the 2040 plan. The 2040 plan, I mean, the zoning changes just happened. So I think the jury's still out in terms of what the consequences of that are going to be. If anything, I think the 2040 plan doesn't go far enough in terms of allowing density, but we do need to have better ways for people to participate, particularly from disinvested communities in decision making.
So the one thing that I would add to this conversation is I think housing is a national issue. You can hardly pick up a newspaper without seeing housing as a crisis across this country, and our region is in the same position. What I think provides an opportunity there is to develop more tools, new tools, more resources, more support to tackle this issue, to respond in a way that reflects that it is a crisis. And so while it's an important question to ask who is profiting, I think another way of thinking about it is what can we do with the increased attention to come up with real solutions that advance and solve this problem for all of the individuals on the economic spectrum, that responds in a way that represents who we are as a community.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives this morning. On that note, we are done. The panelists, I believe, will be hanging out for a few minutes if you have further questions to ask them, but thank you so much for having us.
All right. Thank you, Jessica, our panelists, and all of our distinguished speakers here this morning for having such a great conversation. On behalf of everyone at The Hill and our underwriter, the National Association of Home Builders, we thank everyone in the room and those who tuned in to the live stream and joining us this morning.